Okay, hello everybody, welcome. I'm Douglas Evans, and along with Alex Gaudakis, we created Center for Healthy Sex as a resource to people here in LA and also from actually all over the world, with one caveat: as long as people are English speakers, we can help them. We're not very fluent, not multilingual yet, but we're working on that. But we're here to provide individual, couple, group, and intensive therapy services for men and women from a whole variety of backgrounds with a variety of sexual concerns to address things such as sexual dysfunction, desire differences, sex and love addiction treatment, partner for the support of the sex addict. We offer a wide spectrum of services and been doing that really under Alex's leadership for 19 years and as Center for Healthy Sex for the last 12. And so the other main piece of our focus here is professional training. So every month for the past 7 years, we've been offering these free CEU lectures. We've always had a great variety of speakers. Today will be no exception. And we've also do 18-hour trainings. We just wrapped up our sex therapy trainings. We actually had so much interest. We did it twice this winter. And then every fall, we have an 18-hour sex addiction treatment course. So if you're interested in that, I'm pretty sure, is everybody getting our emails? You're on our email list? Okay, just stay on there and you'll be notified of those. And you're always welcome to inquire about our training opportunities as well as our clinical services. If you send a client here, we will ask for a release to be signed so we can collaborate with you and find out how best to help and assist your client, whatever role you need us to play, whether it's primary therapy or as an adjunct to what you're doing, or maybe to serve the couple, whatever the case may be. So we appreciate your support with that. So today, just one quick reminder. If you need hours from the BDS, that's what the sign-in, sign-out sheet is for. So we're able to grant hours from the BBS. It's 1 hour for today. Please, a couple things. Make sure you sign in and out. If you don't sign out, I can't give you a certificate. It's not my rules. It's BBS. I've got to be able to document that. So make sure you sign out and make sure you print legibly because we'll email you the certificate. If you just need a certificate of attendance, we can also give you those as well. Yes?
It's not for psychologists, right?
It's not. I'm sorry. We don't have a means to grant through the board. Yeah. But it's great information.
Yeah, I know this one.
It'll still be worth the hour.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can still take the attendance, and they have variational self-teaching course, so that would qualify.
Oh, cool.
That's good to know.
CEU expert here.
It's 1 C. I think I can live.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
For
you.
attendance, should I put that on there?
You could, if you want, you can write attendance. If you don't put down a license number, then we know it's not
Okay.
for the BBS. So yeah, it's fine either way. Okay, so today we have Dan Griffin, who is going to be speaking to us today. He's an author and expert in men's relationships and masculinity topics. One of his books is called A Man's Way Through Relationships. Is the first book written specifically to help men create healthy relationships while navigating the challenges of the man rules, which you're going to learn about today, which is ideas that men internalize at a young age about how to be real boys and men. In 2015, Dan was invited to be a senior fellow at the Meadows, which is a major treatment center in Arizona. And his professional background also includes 20 years in the mental health and addiction field. And he's additionally an author of A Man's Way Through 12 Steps. It's the first trauma-informed book to take a holistic look at men's sobriety. And he also co-authored another book called Helping Men Recover. And that was a gender-responsive, trauma-informed curriculum for addiction and mental health professionals. His master's degree was earned in sociology at the University of Kansas, and he did a study there on the social construction of masculinity in Alcoholics Anonymous. And Dan is a recent transplant here to LA, so if you bump into him on the street, just go across the street quickly. But he might be in the presence of his beautiful wife and his charismatic young daughter, which you should say hello. And Dan's company is available to work with treatment facilities and offer workshops and speaking events. And he and his team are pretty dynamic. They have some great things to offer. So if you're interested in knowing more about his work, you can check out his website or just talk to him afterwards. He also just launched something called the Man Rules podcast on iTunes.
And Stitcher are your favorite iTunes or podcast
Yeah, make it your favorite. So you'll hear more
platform.
about it. You get a preview today.
Yeah, that's right.
So please welcome Dan Griffin.
All right. All right. Good afternoon. Oh, come on. This is free and got cookies. Good afternoon. All right. I'm a little claustrophobic, so if I just start shaking and pass out, it's only because of that. All right. So, as was said earlier, my company is Griffin Recovery Enterprises, and this is really kind of our mantra that in today's society, there seems to be a lot of focus on men, some positive, some not so positive, but a lot of it seemingly predicated on changing men, not necessarily predicated on changing how we think or even view men. And so that's a big part of what I do. I consider myself to be somebody who's very focused on understanding and dealing with trauma and appreciating the impact of trauma, and I know a lot of you are that as well. But as somebody who's out there doing workshops and talking about this topic, I know that even the topics that I cover can be triggering for audiences. And so I take very seriously that impact. And so one of the things I always like to do, sometimes also for myself, is I just like to just start by asking everybody to just sit up, to relax your feet, relax your body, and just join me for like just a little bit of conscious breathing. And this is a tool that we use for men, and I always point this out because I think it's really critical. Everything I do comes from the place of what works well for men. What's going to resonate? What are men going to respond to? And does it make a difference, right? That's what gender responsive means, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Does it make a difference that if you give a man a tool for being able to take care of himself and do self-care, that nobody knows they're doing it? That nobody has to know they're doing it? That he can, at any point at a baseball game, while he is lifting weights, while he's in the boardroom, while he's hanging out with his family, while he's in a meeting, he can just stop and just take some deep breaths that can have an automatic, immediate response on him, his anxiety, his ability to take care of himself, and at the same time, he doesn't feel as though he's lost any face or compromised the degree to which he's invested in his masculinity or looking a certain way, right? So that's breathing, and that's one of the many tools that we use and the intention behind it. The other reason is because it just works very, very well. So if you would, just breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. Take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth with a sigh. See, it's always nice being in LA when I do that, because like when I'm in other parts, it's like I say let out with a sigh, and people are like, oh. You know? But like the first time in LA, people are like, oh yeah, I just came from my massage anyways, so it's like I'm already relaxed anyways, dude, and I'm going swimming after this. All right, and having my avocado fries. So the other piece that we do is called boxed breathing, advanced breathing, combat breathing. Some of you are probably familiar with this. But you breathe in for the count of 4, you hold it for the count of 4, you breathe out for the count of 4, and you rest for the count of 4. But there's some real intention behind that, because by being able to count while you're breathing, you're being able to also keep the prefrontal cortex online, as well as fully engage in the body, right? So if you would, let's just do a couple of those. And that is, so breathe in through your nose for the count of 4. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 2, 3, 4. Rest. 2, 3, 4. Let's do 2 more. All right. I always like to do it because it also just helps me calm down. You just notice like my voice changes. I just feel a little lighter. So I don't know if any of you have seen me present before or heard me or anything like that, but I have a core concept that I talk about. All my work is kind of built around this concept because it enables from my perspective, for a deeper, pun intended, conversation, right? So I use this concept that I call the water. Anybody familiar with David Foster Wallace? Really one of the geniuses of 20th century literature. He wrote a book called Infinite Jest, but he also did a commencement speech at Kenyon College, and he talked about the concept of the water. And it's also used in a lot of spiritual practice, and especially in mysticism. But it's a parable. Two fish are at the bottom of the ocean, hanging out, Another fish swims up, looks at him, is like, hey guys, how's it going? How's the water? And then swims off. And then the two fish are hanging out, and they look at each other and they say, well, what the hell is water, right? And that's us. That's our reality. That's our consciousness or lack thereof that we are constantly in. Like we wake up in the water. We may or may not have any awareness of being in the water over any course of a day because we're just doing our thing, right? One core component that I found through my work is that a huge element of the water is gender. That the narrative of gender is so deep in the water that we very often, not only are we not so aware of it, but we often don't even realize how much we're creating the narrative and feel as though the narrative is creating us, which is what we'll often say, right? Oh, that's just how girls are. That's just how boys are. Though that's just a girl brain being a girl brain, or a boy brain being a boy brain. Well, I'm a critical sociologist, so if you haven't guessed at this point, I don't necessarily, I have not solved the mystery of the nature-nurture riddle, but I also have some pretty strong beliefs about the impact of nurture on our impact and our experience of reality. But just to demonstrate how significant I feel this is, think of when a woman's pregnant, okay? Woman's pregnant, what's one of the first questions we ask? What are you having, a boy or a girl, right? Out here in LA, it's always so exciting because what do we have now? What are these parties we're having? Gender reveal parties, right? So you cut into the cake, and if the icing is pink, you're having and the icing's blue, you're having a boy. Okay. So, no judgment about that, but it's interesting, right? I mean, that certainly says something about boys and about girls and about the narrative that we're in. So, let's say we're having a baby and we're 3 months in, we find out, oh my gosh, we're having a girl. Well, that's super exciting, right? So we're having a girl. What are we going to do? What's the narrative that we start to write, whether we want to or not? What do we start? Okay, we start thinking of names like Pat. That's the idea. But there are certain names we may be thinking of, right? And then do we have maybe a baby shower? And what do we get at the baby shower? Pink clothes and dolls, right? I mean, that seems to still be fairly common. I've got a 7-year-old, she's almost 8. I've been to a lot of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old parties. There's a lot of that still going on. But now this is a narrative we're writing about this little girl, okay? And now let's say we're 6 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, okay? We're still writing this narrative. And this is what we have in our minds. So we've got, this is what we want. We have these toys. We have this room. What are we doing to the room? Painting it. And what are we painting? Feminine colors, right? Pink and, oh wait. Feminine colors, right. Okay, so like this color. But I'm metrosexual, so it's okay. So we've got the narrative, right? The narrative, now we go see the doctor, the 8-month visit. 8-month checkup. Doctor comes out. I've got good news, and I've got new news. The good news is the baby's fine. The new news is we missed something. That's the only time you can do that in reference to this particular thing and get away with it. But we missed something. You're having a boy. what happens? What happens to the narrative? Changes? How about collapses for some people? Oh my God! What about the dolls, the dresses, the this, the that, the pink, the paint? Now who's gonna wear my wedding dress? Oh, yes, now I got somebody I can play football with. I'm not saying that's true, I'm not saying that's real, but those are the narratives and those are the ideas we have in our head. And remember, we've had all this narrative about this little creature that has yet to be born. Yet to be born. And then all of us are born into the water. We're born into the water. And the research still shows that baby boys are held less, caressed less, soothed less, talked to in a different tone of voice, allowed to be by themselves longer, treated differently. And if you take a boy or a baby with a penis, right, that has all the kind of external appearance of a boy, what we consider a boy, and I'll explain why I'm saying it that way. But if we take that boy and we put him in a pink blanket, what happens? It's held more. It's rocked more. Anybody ever had any training on attachment? Anybody think this might have something to do with attachment? From the moment the child is born? So what we talk about when we talk about male socialization is that men are raised to be agents of disconnection. And that boys are born into a world of disconnection. And it's heartbreaking. And it starts literally that soon. But that's the water, right? So the baby's born and we're already treating the baby a certain way based on the idea that we think it's a boy or a girl. And remember, I can take a boy, what we consider to be a boy, and put him in a pink blanket, and now we're treating him as if he's a girl. So it's not even based on reality. It's based a lot on what we make up or what we perceive things to be, right? So that's part of the water. Part of the water is that we're not necessarily aware of it. The babies are born into it. We're in it. We're interacting with this little creature that same way. And it's what leads my daughter when she was 2 years old, and we're at daycare in Minnesota where I moved from. And she's coming down the hall and we see this guy, guy's like 6'3", 6'4", and he's got this beautiful long black hair, right? And she looks up at him and she says, "That is a very tall woman." Because that was true for her. Did I sit her down and say, all women have long hair? No, I don't need to. Because that's the other thing about how we learn. We are meaning-making machines. We are constantly making up meaning as a way to live in this world, making up meaning about what did that look mean? What did that mean? But when we're babies, making up meaning is essential to our lives. It's essential to survival. We make up meaning in order to feel safe, in order to have some sense of structure around the world, right? So when I see something that has some kind of commonality or some persistence in my reality, I make it mean then that means something. So, okay, my daughter had only seen, I didn't have long hair. Her mom had long hair. Her grandmother had long hair. Her aunt had long hair. Her other grandmother had long hair. She sees other girls with long hair. The other girls have moms with long hair. And there's like this one guy who had long hair. And the rest of us guys, none of us had long hair. So she makes that up, right? Why is that important? Well, is there anything about long hair, inherently about long hair, that's for women? Is there anything inherently about the pink or blue that's for women? Inherently. Like, I mean, if we look back in the history of the world, has it always been that pink is a feminine color? No, you can actually look at the history and you can see in different cultures and different countries and different times how pink was used and how it was viewed and how it was either for women or for men or for certain times or prohibited from being worn. There's no inherent reality. There's no inherent meaning to that color. Just like a dress that women wear, right? What's the inherent meaning of a dress?
Not only of today, I mean,
Still today, men do wear dresses in some cultures, right? Right? So there's no inherent meaning to a dress. However, there's a lot of emotional attachment to the meaning we create, right? Because if I were to do this workshop, if I do this conversation with you all, and I came out wearing a dress, you might have certain judgments. You might make certain assumptions. Who knows, right? But if there wasn't really some strong emotional attachment, I mean, are we all in agreement that a lot of this is made up, right? I mean, like in other cultures, in Morocco, it's the men of the highest station only who can wear dresses and makeup. So it's not an inherently feminine thing. So if that's made up, and if there's something to the idea that it is made up, does it also mean something that when somebody who isn't supposed to wear a dress wears a dress and we kill them because they're wearing a dress? See, that's how deep the water is, and that's what we're in, right? So we look around and see how many of us consciously or unconsciously put on our little gender outfits today. Right? We all did. We all did. But I mean, I don't think you woke up, got out of bed, and was like, oh, yes, okay, I live in a woman box, so let me open up my woman closet and see all my woman clothes and put on all my feminine apparel to go with my woman costume. We just do it, right? So you're born into the water, and you learn it from everybody else, and you learn these rules, and you learn what I call these man rules, these woman rules. We learn rules of gender. I mean, what's exploding in our society today is this amazing conversation about gender that's challenging everything. And I am certainly not going to pretend like I understand it, but it is fascinating. As a sociologist, as a human being, it is fascinating. So I talk about the woman rules and the man rules because whether we believe that that binary is true, it is the binary still in which we very much live. This idea that one is a man or a woman, male or female. And so I talk about the man rules. The man rules are critical for me when I talk about men because it's understanding that is part of understanding the water. Because again, these man rules we take in very passively. Nobody is sitting us down with a list saying, here's what you have to do, but we learn it. Because when I do this lecture all around the country and even internationally, I get the same answers every single time. When I say to an audience, what are the man rules? What are the man rules? What are the rules that we teach young boys about how to be men and that men live by to varying degrees, but what are those dominant rules? Just shout out some of them. Don't cry. Don't feel. Be strong. Don't be a girl. Be successful. Make a lot of money. Take whatever you want. Don't ask for permission. Don't ask for directions. Man up, right? So don't ask for directions, which also can mean even bigger, don't ask for help, right? So this is really interesting. So normally, just this conversation is a 2-hour conversation. So I'm giving you the kind of the quick amphetamine version. So here's the interesting thing. Have I met any of you before? No. Not really. Have I asked you this question before? I don't know. Okay. Is there any way I could have known what you were going to say? Oh my gosh, wait a second. It's amazing. The amazing Karnak has somehow figured out exactly what everybody was going to say because it's the same everywhere I go. Everywhere I go, we have these rules, these don'ts that are so strong. And if I were to do this and have these, when I do this as a interactive lecture and we have the time to really get into it, what I will always get is the don't cry, be strong, don't be weak, don't ask for help, all of this. Very often what is missed is this. And so what I've actually started doing is, because it's always there, as soon as I say, well, are there any more positive aspects to this? People are like, oh yeah, well what about this, this, and this? So it's always there, but if I were to like do this true to form, this would be about a 7-point font. Because it's always there, but it's a whisper. So like one of the more positives is respect women. Never hit a woman. And yet the louder ones are Don't ask for help. Don't show emotion. Don't be weak. Don't back down. Win at all costs. Always have power. And don't be a girl. Don't respect that associated with girls. And don't respect that within you that is associated with girls or within anybody else. And then also be nice to girls and value them and love them. So there's a lot of contradictions within the man rules. But this is what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on the man rules for sex. So I started doing this, and I would get different responses. But what was very interesting for me is I kept getting the same rules for sex over and over and over again. And I was like, wow, this is very interesting. So I just put it into a sentence because the experience of sex is so core to our ideas of being men. And I'll unpack that more in a little bit. But this is the sentence I came up with. Have as much sex as possible, whenever possible, with as many hot and different women. What should it be? Chicks, bitches, hoes, pieces, right? So, like, here's the deal, y'all. We're going to have an honest conversation about men and sex. So if you by any means are offended by, like, the real language, I'm just going to tell you it's going to be a rough ride for, like, the next 35 minutes for you. This title of this talk is actually The Man Rules in Sex. Because it ain't just about... No. It got censored. Not by them, but it's gotten censored by the rest of academia. It ain't just about fucking. Because that's really, men don't make love, men fuck, right? And all of this is very intentional. All of this is not very conscious, but this is all part of the water. And this is all part of the water when we're talking about men and sex. And we'll talk more about that. But in many hot and different...
You might as well put objects as possible.
Absolutely. Well, what is one of the disgusting jokes we have about women as boys growing up? What's that useless piece of flesh you call surrounding a vagina? Woman. Whoa. Yeah, that's a joke that we told. And I think that was a joke that I had adults tell me. Like, that's the ugliness of the water. That's the way that men kind of hide their fear of women and their confusion about all of this, and all of that contempt and all of that confusion and fear around sex and all of this don't be a girl and don't be gay stuff that's just constantly swirling inside of us. We do that by making such horrible comments, and yet it's a reality. And if you want to judge it, good luck working effectively with men, because we come by it honestly. We don't choose to be this, to think this. It gets inculcated into us in so many myriad of different ways. Yes?
I think the culture is really changing.
It is.
A lot of what you're talking about.
It absolutely is.
I have kids in their 20s.
Yes.
And I know them, I know their friends, I know their attitudes towards a lot of this.
Yes.
Now, granted, they grew up in California,
No, it's very real.
aggressive.
It's very real.
But it's really changing on all those.
So here's how I'll respond to that, because I'm just going to really focus on time and getting through this, but you're absolutely right, because I was going to get to that. For all people right now, everything is falling apart when it comes to the man rules. Everything's falling apart when it comes to the woman rules. So this is the critical component. Because for anything that you want to say, at any reason why, particularly from a perspective of attachment or a perspective of trauma, if you really want to understand why men and boys follow these rules, it's because they ultimately give us safety. When I stopped crying, I stopped getting the shit beat out of me, and I stopped being made fun of. When I stopped asking for help, I stopped being told I was stupid. When I stopped playing the piano and playing with dolls, I stopped being laughed at and was more respected by the other boys and my dad, right? When I was being rougher and more aggressive with women, I got more respect from women. So let's be honest about it. The man rules are internalized by men and women, and it's very confusing today. That's what I would say. It is very confusing. I could take your son and his friends, and I could sit them down, and I would get these exact same rules. And what I'll get is like, but that really doesn't apply to us. And then we'll spend 2 hours together and they'll see exactly how much it still applies in these very subtle, confusing ways. I'm gay, let's say. How do I know you're safe for me? Okay? I'm a very sensitive, emotional man. How do I know you're safe for me? You say you want an emotional, sensitive guy, but the last 3 that showed up in your life, you had a hard time with. How do I know I'm going to be safe with you? It's the confusion. It's the lack of consistency. 40 years ago, it was like men are providers, women are caretakers. Women are the emotional carriers of the relationship. Men are the providers, and they just do that component. They discipline, but they are not about the attachment component. There was a lot of this, and I'm not saying it was ever worked that clearly, but that box was pretty stark, and it was pretty clearly drawn. But now it's not. It's not nearly as clear. And so your son is like, your son's generation is our hope. But they're our hope only to the degree that there is consciousness connected to it. When there is a belief that somehow they have transcended it, I can promise you the foundation, the tectonic plates of the man rules and the woman rules are so much stronger than we can appreciate. And so I think that's the challenge, right? So you're absolutely correct. So this is what Brene Brown said, which I think is very powerful, right? The messages and expectations that bring us to our knees are so organized by gender. Those are the man rules. Those are the woman rules. So here's how I got to what I got to. I'm in recovery. I got into recovery right out of college. I was a mess in college. You know, I saw my first pornographic magazine when I was 6. Yeah, and it didn't stop there. Okay, I, at the age of 15 and a half, started getting treated with testosterone shots to grow. I had my first sexual experience when I was 17, and it lasted 3 seconds, and nobody ever told me to expect that or know what that was about. I felt incredibly humiliated, ashamed. I broke up with her 30 minutes later, never to see her again and never to have sex sober again until I got sober and was like 2 years sober. I was scared to death of sex and my sexuality. So the body image stuff that I got as a result of the growth hormone and all of that was something that men aren't even supposed to have. I sat through course after course of women's body image and this and that, and I knew like what was going on internally. I never felt safe enough to talk about all the stuff I was carrying because I so often heard, but this is what women struggle with. Men don't have this. Men don't have that. So it was like compelled to either find out, am I really that much of an anomaly and a freak, an aberration of masculinity, or is there something else going on? So when I got into recovery, I also got into sociology around the same time, and I went into my first AA meeting and a man tried to hug me. And a half hour later, I'm listening to a man named Bud who had I'm in Harrisonburg, Virginia, small town, Virginia. This guy had a white t-shirt. He had a hat that said, honk if you love tits. And I mean, I judged him immediately from my little suburban Maryland, comfortable, violent alcoholic home upbringing. I judged him. And a half hour later, this man is almost in tears talking about how afraid he is. And I'm like, what the heck is going on here? So I said, what is this all about? So that's when I actually saw the water in many ways. But it was only because of this confluence of things that people don't necessarily get. So when I started doing my master's research, and when I wrote A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, I started every conversation of over 60 men with the same question. What does it mean to be a man in recovery? How have your ideas of being a man changed since getting into recovery? That was the exact question I asked them. Guess what the number one answer was? Close. They haven't. They haven't. Shocking. Why is that shocking? I mean, look at this. This is what we're talking about. This is the container. Okay, when the objectives or whatever the description of this workshop says, talk about what I think is a fundamental flaw in the way we work clinically with men. That fundamental flaw is a lack of understanding of this dichotomy right here. These are the man rules. This is what we meant men to do in therapy and recovery. And we don't want them to do it once or twice. We want them to do it. As a man who, if by the grace of God, Sunday will have 23 years of recovery, which is great, and thank you very much. But I'm not saying it for that. I'm saying it 23 years into recovery, this dichotomy and the cognitive dissonance of this dichotomy kicks my ass on a daily basis. Of me choosing to not ask for help versus ask for help. Me choosing to not cry versus to cry or grieve or be more vulnerable versus not being vulnerable. To allow myself to let go of any of the sexual expectations that I have in my relationship with my wife, or to be able to be vulnerable with my daughter and not just have to be a disciplinarian or not just have to have my dad take over inside of me. All of that is on a daily basis. How many times when we're working with men do we acknowledge this? How many times are men experiencing this? What we do, what my company and I, what we do is we have built a whole framework of service provision, of support for men, and even material that's all built around this dichotomy and honoring this dichotomy. Because if the man rules and following the man rules are about safety, then what is this? Danger, not safe. We are constantly putting men in an unsafe situation. Well, what does anybody do in an unsafe situation? Oftentimes we have three choices, right? What are they? Fight, freeze, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. So, which are men maybe more likely to do? Fight. So you put me in your environment. Hey, yeah, we're so awesome. Thanks, so great to see you. Yeah, hey, you're going to love it here. We got yoga and horses and everything. Yeah, hey, so do this, do all this, okay? And then you'll be great, okay? So then I don't feel safe. Do I feel safe? I might not feel safe. Have you talked to me about the idea that this might not feel safe for me? Have you talked about the idea that you're actually taking something away from me that for some of us are so core to who we think we are and keeps us safe that you are actually re-traumatizing us? Do you talk to us about this? Do you talk to me about this? I didn't hear it. And the men we work with aren't hearing it. They're coming from 10, 15, 20 treatment centers who are not talking to them about this. Am I meaning to shame or criticize anybody? No, because we don't know what we don't know. But is it not amazing when you see this in black and white like this, how obvious it is? And yet how elusive it is? I do not know of programs that are predicated on this reality or this understanding. I don't know people who are trained on this. I don't know. I mean, you put me in a situation like this and I fight. How are you going to respond to me? What do you do? What are your words that you use about me?
The client's resistant.
Oh, the client's resistant. What else about Dan? He's not showing up for his recovery. He must not want it.
He's got an anger problem.
Oh, he's got an anger problem. You know what? You know what we call it when the men start fighting this? We call it engagement. We call that engagement because we have not acknowledged to them what they are feeling or they are clearly experiencing, which is this is uncomfortable as hell. Ah, yes, you're right. And that's okay. Now, for some men, actually myself, I was one of them, right? Always emotional, always sensitive. The growth problem stuff just really had me question masculinity. I lived outside of masculinity for a very long time, just kind of analyzing it and just kind of saying, like, I don't want to be any of that. So I lived in this negative relationship to masculinity, which is what a lot of this younger generation's doing. They're not living in a conscious masculinity. They're living in an anti-masculinity. Well, what you resist persists. You can't live against something without it controlling you. So that's part of what's happening in our society is there's not this clear framework for what a healthy conscious masculinity is. So that's part of what's missing. But the other part that's missing is like really understanding how are men responding to this? For me, when I came into treatment, I was like, oh God, thank God. Thank God there's a place now where I can be emotional and people aren't going to laugh at me. Like I cried and the person actually said, wow, that was really brave of you. Whoa, you're not going to hit me? That's nuts, right? However, it'd be nice if that's how it worked. But while that was somewhat validating for me, that wasn't validating for my masculinity. It actually reinforced the idea that I still wasn't much of a man. because we don't talk to men about this in the context of masculinity. What we say, and that's why these guys, when I said, how have your ideas of being a man changed since getting into recovery? What we say to them is, you want to save your life? Do this. You want to save your marriage? Do this. You want to save your job? Do this. So we do this. And then we do this, and because we haven't done this, because we haven't been allowed to do this for so long, and it feels good, we want to keep doing it. But then what happens is that if this is a trauma, in many ways you could call this a trauma response. If this is a trauma response, when I get stressed and I'm trying to live in this, where am I going to go back to? This. We see it all the time in the recovery community. Hang out with guys in 5, 10, 15 years and hear about them in their most emotional, vulnerable places and watch how quickly this comes up. I sounded beautiful in meetings. Oh, I'm eloquent as hell. Seriously. I'm sensitive. I rope them in really, really well. But come into my lair and I'm a mess because nobody taught me how to actually navigate that sensitivity, that emotionality, that vulnerability, the trauma connected to all of this. So when I say, as I do all the time, it's not them, it's us. How we're failing men in treatment, I believe this is the core of it. When you begin to shift and really see what we're asking men to do and we're helping men begin to experience. When we do this for men, we do this as a group. They list out the man rules. We have a conversation about the man rules. They list out the principles of therapy and recovery. We get them up on the wall, and never have I done it where at least one man hasn't been like, holy shit. No wonder this has been so hard. It's like my tears fill my eyes every time I hear that. It's like, how hard has it been? How many of these guys who are fighting because of the pain of this, we kick out? Oh, he's defiant. Oh, he doesn't want it. Come back when you're serious. Come back when you're ready to let me be in charge. You're ready to let go of your ego, this and that. All of that. When the truth is, it's just a person who's been re-traumatized who doesn't feel safe trying to find safety. It's actually our responsibility. We're the ones who are failing them, and we're kicking them out. We're the ones who are failing them at 5 years of recovery because we haven't talked to them about this. And so in their best efforts to try to navigate the pain of vulnerability and intimacy and emotion, we try to navigate this as best we can. And we fight and we fly and we freeze, right? And how do we fight? We fight by getting into all kinds of crazy behavior. How do we flee? ESPN, work, porn. Right? That is often a traumatic, from a detachment perspective, a relational perspective, that's a response. Oh yeah, we're just going to watch the game, honey. Don't you want to be with me? I do, after the 10 games that are on, that now I'm allowed to watch all at the same time while porn is on in my periphery. Who needs women? So this is what I talk about. I talk about conscious masculinity. And I don't believe there's anything wrong per se. I don't believe that men are the problem. I believe how men have been raised is the problem. There's a big difference. So what I tell the guys that I work with and the professionals and programs we work with is that the message we have to really give to the men is it's not about doing it perfectly, it's about doing it consciously. Who is the man you want to be? You know, we get all these different clinical questions we can always ask. We ask one fundamental question. How does that fit with the man you want to be? No shame, no judgment, no like, oh, I know what kind of man you're supposed to be. Shut up. You don't know what man he's supposed to be. You don't know what it takes for him to show up every day. You don't know what it takes for him to actually ask for help. You don't know what it takes for him to actually show emotion other than anger. You don't know any of that. You don't know what kind of man I'm supposed to be. Your job is to help facilitate my own inner wisdom about the man that I want to be and help with compassion me find that man. That's part of it, but it runs incredibly deep. So what I talk about is this idea of men's integrated treatment, where we've done a pretty good job dealing with addiction. We're doing pretty good with mental health. We still don't talk about them nearly enough together, and we've got trauma. And trauma is becoming a fad. It's becoming a word that people are just pasting on their marketing materials. It's like, oh, we do trauma, right? Again, I got a yoga instructor, I got a horse, and this person was trained for 2 hours in EMDR. We are good. Trauma, we do, right? Don't even look at our staff and how traumatized they are, and don't seriously look at the rest of the organization and how dysfunctional it is. Focus on the services. Focus on the services, please, because that's trauma. That's not trauma-informed, right? In fact, that's trauma-insensitive. Male psychological development has been absent. Raise your hand if you got any kind of extensive training on male psychological development in order to prepare you to do any kind of work with men. In just the 15 minutes or whatever, 25, oh boy, all right, 45 minutes that I've been talking, have I made a decent case for why male psychological development maybe is really quite imperative in understanding and how the context? So we talk about gender responsive treatment, and that is simply a systemic approach. It's not, hey, I do a group for men on Fridays. It means I look at how we greet men. I look at how we think about men. I listen to how we talk about men. I look at the way that the rooms are designed, the materials that are available, the comments that we make when we say, oh, well, there he is again. Oh, that's what he does. We are forced to look at our own internalization of the man rules, the woman rules, and how that plays out in every interaction we have with every client we have and every staff person who comes before us. That's gender responsive. So again, men are not the problem. And in this world of hypermasculinity, which we still see, again, to your comment, here's what I think. I think we've got a divide right now. There are the men who are desperately, for safety, for a very good reason, clinging to the man rules, saying, please don't take this away from me. It's all I have. It's all I know about who I am. I don't know who I am without that. And then there's this whole other group of men, and it's your son's generation, my generation, and even older generations that are saying like, ugh, the pain of this far outweighs my willingness to do something different and step into that lack of safety. But in this space of hypermasculinity, there is a lot for us to learn. So we all know this, right? It's kind of basic that the Greek for the word trauma is traumatikos, which means wound, right? But in the language of men, trauma equals weak. And again, we talk about trauma all the time. We bring these guys into these programs and we talk to them about trauma. Do we really understand what we're asking them to talk about? Do we really understand how many layers? I've been doing trauma work for over 10 years, and I am still amazed at the depth of the pain that I protected myself from by simply saying, it's not trauma. That wasn't trauma. That was me growing up. That was my parents helping me to be a man. I was a real pain in the ass as a kid. All of that is the context, is the construct, the narrative that men have around what is trauma. And those of us who work in the field, if we have the fortune/misfortune of being able to interact with people who have such severe trauma, we can always just look at them and say, now that's trauma. I just grew up in an alcoholic home with an abusive dad on a golf course, never wanting for anything materially. How is that trauma? Plus, not to mention, I'm a grown-ass man. I was 6 there. Now, what we all know is that your brain doesn't care how old you were. Your brain does not care if you're a 40-year-old man when you had the crap beat out of you in 6. And your brain doesn't care if you're a successful CEO or athlete or teacher or whatever, because when you get activated and you get triggered, your brain says, I'm 6, I'm a failure, I'm scared, I am powerless, all of that. So connection, disconnection, reconnection. In the relational world, it's all about connection, disconnection, and reconnection. And we teach women how to connect. Part of the woman rules is about being relational. It's led to this idea that says women are just so inherently relational. Well, I have some thoughts about that. But we teach women to connect. We teach men to disconnect. We teach neither of us how to reconnect. And it's the reconnection that is everything. And so that is really what it means when we talk about attachment, when we talk about attachment trauma, when we talk about repairing relationships. My daughter has taught me so dramatically the value of repairing and reconnecting that I never got. My wife and I have learned how to reconnect with each other so much better because of how we've been able to repair with our daughter and say, like, geez, we're doing that with her. Maybe we should do that with each other too. So all of that is what the dominant language, whether it's quantum physics to biology to anthropology to neurobiology, all of it is saying we are all hardwired for relationship, all of us. So I created what's called the paradox of male relational intimacy. All that simply says is one day, as I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about my own experience in relationships and other men's experience in relationships, I realized, holy crap, this has nothing to do with therapy or recovery. This is about any relationship any man is in, period. Because that's what we expect of men in a healthy relationship. And see, 20 years ago, we just didn't really expect men to be in healthy relationships. We didn't. There wasn't the Oprahfication of our society. There really wasn't. There wasn't this massive expectation that everybody was going to show up authentically and vulnerably and intimacy and love and all of that. And so it's great. But the expectations for men have risen exponentially, while the guidance on how to meet those expectations has been minimal. But we're still holding them to that standard. But if in treatment and in recovery this is re-traumatizing, guess what? In relationships, it's re-traumatizing. And so again, we fight and we flee and we freeze in these relationships, trying to navigate as best we can the waters of intimacy, being pulled down by the undertow of the man rules over and over again, not even realizing it. I desperately wanted connection. I'm a very relational person, and I would go around and I would step into this with no emotional muscle. People were just like, oh yeah, you're so sensitive, you're so emotional, oh, girls are going to love you, it's going to be great. No, it wasn't great for me and it wasn't great for them. And so this is the other part of the water that we have to really help men, whether it's men in their recovery or not, but I've just watched so many men long into their recovery struggle with this because nobody's talking to them about it. Yeah, I've got a foothold in recovery. I got sponsees. I got a real understanding of the culture, but I can't save my marriage. I don't know how to connect with my kids. And what's it worth? And that's why we have so many guys who are putting bullets through their brains and they're not using, because the man rules are nice and strong in that one. By God, I will not use. But I'll kill myself. Right? Or I'll burn this whole marriage to the ground with domestic violence and porn and work addiction and rage addiction and everything else. All of it predicated, I believe, in this crucible. So it runs very, very deep. And it in very, very micro ways. I could have a wonderful interaction one day and a very challenged interaction the next day. But without the awareness, without the consciousness, I don't know what I'm experiencing. I don't know how to navigate it. I don't understand. A lot of us men in recovery especially, but any man who's kind of been walking a spiritual, personal growth path, we sometimes just don't understand why we fall back so quickly into those man rules. Like, that's not where I want to be. That's where you're going. That's what the brain says. Safety, safety. That's not where I want to be. That's where you're going. Whoop, whoa. Not asking for help. Not being vulnerable. Go to hell. So let's talk about sex. And the man rules are so embedded in sex. I mean, here it is, right? These hot and different chicks, as big of a dick as possible. I mean, this is what we're dealing with when we talk about men and sexuality. And here's kind of my blanket statement that I'll make. I was not, I worked in primarily alcohol and other drug disorders and mental health. So then I started getting involved more with sex addiction and other addictive processes. So I went to my first sex addiction program and I sat there and I read the assessment. And I thought every single man in America should have this. This is not special. This is about male socialization. This is about how embedded a corrupt and dysfunctional idea of sexuality is in how we're raised as men, and how our ability to be intimate, vulnerable, and connected is torn from us when we're 6 and we see porn for the first time. And then that becomes the bar. And then we're just told all the time, that's all men think about. All men ever think about is sex. So intimacy equals sex. Of course it does. In the work that we do, this was a book that was out of date when we found it, but a husband and wife couple in the 70s, they identified 12 different forms of intimacy, and there's even many more than that. In the work that we do with the men in the curriculum, helping men recover, in session 11, we have the men identify relationships in every one of these 12. And they begin to see how full their lives are of intimacy. It is a lie that men don't know how to do intimacy. It is a lie that men are not engaged in intimate relationships. We are constantly enrolled and engaged in intimacy. It's just we're not put in that context.
Can you go back?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between creative and recreational?
So creative, what do you think it might be?
Creative, I don't know, like through art?
Yes. And recreational would be like, let's go play some basketball. Yeah. So there could be some overlap, but that's exactly right. You know,
Aesthetic, sorry.
aesthetic, conflict. The aesthetic is more like watching and looking at art and admiring art. And the creative is in creating art or creating experiences. But all of these are different forms of intimacy that all of us are engaged in all the time, and men are engaged in all the time, but we don't view it as intimacy. And so we just keep perpetuating the lie that says, well, men don't do intimacy. But I mean, look at this. Have as much sex possible whenever possible. And if you say no to sex, and if you're not prepared to have sex, if you don't want to have sex, if you don't know how to have sex, if you physiologically, like me when I was 15 trying to date, couldn't have sex, the trauma for me was being found out. Like, I've got these girls that like me, and then I'm like, well, what's going to happen if I start kissing? And it was absolutely horrible because I knew that I'd become a man once I had sex. All the movies were telling me that. All the books and everything else, everybody was telling me I'm not a man until I have sex. With as many hot and different chicks as possible. Monogamy? Loving somebody? Oh, he's whipped. Pussy whipped. Right? Hot and different chicks as possible. Don't respect women, objectify them. Because if you don't, if you have to see the person, then you're going to get attached, man. They're going to get you. They're going to get you with their wily ways. No, it's actually because we crave connection. We all are wired for connection, right? And then with as big of a dick as possible, as somebody who pays attention to this, the social reference to penis size and the importance of penis size has exploded in the past 10 years. Everywhere now, in movies and shows, you hear it. If you did a contextual analysis of like the 10 years before and the most recent 10 years, you would be amazed at the number of times that that's referred to and that it's somehow meant to be a part of our masculinity. And of course, dicks come in all different sizes. And some guys can use them when they're smaller, and some guys don't have a clue to do with them when they're bigger, and some fit better inside certain parts and other parts, and some go in vaginas, some go on butts and anuses and all that stuff. It's all part of it. But we don't think about it like that. We just think if you don't have a big dick, you're not a man. If you don't have the biggest office, you're not a man. If you don't have the biggest car, you're not a man. If you don't have the biggest bank account, you're not a man. Big is the name of the game. You got a big dick, but you are a custodial engineer? You're the President of the United States? Sorry.
Don't go there.
So, here's the water, folks. Okay, here's the water of which I speak. Okay, I don't know why I always do this when I say the water. There's the water. Ugh. All right. Erectile dysfunction used to be known as impotency, which means
You're not powerful. You're not
lacking power. So we literally used to equate a man's ability to achieve an erection for any number of reasons with power, and power with masculinity. And we wonder why men didn't and still don't come forward. We wonder why the shame that men carry around their bodies falling apart leads them to affairs, leads them to do violent acts against themselves and others, leads them to do any number of things to get away from the fact that as your ability to achieve an erection decreases, so does your masculinity inherently. And that's part of the water. And that's constantly in so many men's minds. When you are an opiate addict and you are unable to achieve an erection, what do you think's going through these guys' minds? How often do we really talk about it? These guys are coming into our programs and we kind of like, oh yeah, well, you know, you got that whole kind of floppy dick syndrome with the opiates. Oh yeah, sure do. But do we have a really honest conversation about the shame about that and what the men are doing to try to navigate that and how it affects them and how it, and more importantly, affects them in their recovery? Because that's what I'm really concerned about. You might be a great program, you might be a great therapist, you might create a really safe space, but if you're not talking about all this and that dichotomy that I talked about, if you're not preparing them for this and for that in their society and their community and going back home, we're setting them up for failure. And you see it happening in men's sober communities all over the place. So it runs deep. Porn? Of course. Sex robots? Please. A sex robot? Are you kidding me? That's like the essence of the man rules. You will do whatever I want you to do. Check. You'll have sex with me anytime I want to have sex with you. Check. You don't care how I treat you? Check. You don't care about connection? Check. You don't care about whether I am nice to you? Check. You're available anytime for me to do anything I want? Check. Of course I want a sex robot because it enables you to believe what we believe about men. It enables me to believe what I believe about myself, which is I'm incapable of connection because nobody showed me how. That all I ever think about is sex because that's what I've been told. And that all I deserve is sex. These guys who are doing this are terrified. But of course I go to porn. It's the perfect lover for so many men who are terrified, who are traumatized, who don't know how to attach, who don't know how to connect. We have given them porn. Of course they do. Do we have that compassion? Do we have that understanding when we really run up against that, when we see that? Are we shocked that this is happening? Of course it's happening. And men deserve so much better. And yet it seems that we're like blaming men for doing exactly what we've trained them to do. See, there you go again, guys, just confirming everything we already knew about you. All you care about is sex. All you want is sex. You give a shit about anybody other than yourself. Blah, blah, blah. The man rules are about disconnection. The man rules for sex are about disconnection. It's all disconnection. It's all about uncreating intimacy because intimacy scares us because we're taught not to know how to do anything that intimacy addresses. Don't even talk about homophobia and misogyny and what that does to our relationships. Don't be a girl and don't be gay. We're so huge. So just to wrap up, this is a concept that I created that there's a concept called the anger funnel, which is where you look at shame, hurt, sadness, fear, and insecurity. And it all goes through a funnel and it comes out as anger. I think a lot of you are familiar with that idea, that anger is a secondary feeling in a lot of ways. But what I have not really heard talked about is this idea of a sex funnel, which is where all of these experiences of connection and closeness go in a funnel and they come out as some form of sex. Put the two together, then you got some interesting stuff. Right? So there's so much more that we can talk about. But here's my belief. I believe we're a traumatized field, working with traumatized clients, and we send them to traumatized communities. So us doing our work on our own trauma is what's really going to transform our clients' lives. But we keep thinking it's about the services. So just some resources that are available. We've got this from SAMHSA, which is free, called Tip 56. You may or may not be aware of it, called Addressing the Specific Behavioral Health Needs of Men. And this is up on my website too, so you can go find this. This is a curriculum I talked about, Helping Men Recover, co-authored with Stephanie Covington and a gentleman named Rick Dower. Man's Way Through the 12 Steps. Douglas talked about that, A Man's Way Through Relationships. I break down the man rules. And then I'm working, I just decided actually this week off of a response from an audience in DC that what I've never really done is written this book. I wrote this book, but I didn't write it really laying out that whole dichotomy about the tension in those relationships and really the full impact of that. So I'm going to be working on something that really digs into that. Alan Berger, some of you may be familiar with Alan Berger around here, very good friend of mine. He and I are writing a book together called What Men Would Tell You If They Weren't Too Busy Watching TV. We're writing it specifically for women to provide a better education about the man rules, a more compassionate look for men, and how to help them. It's available on iTunes as a download. That's the audio CD is, and then the book's coming out. That's my company. If you want to stay in touch with me, like what I'm talking about, want to get on my list, it's really easy. Just text the man rules to 22828. I am working on my issues, so if you stay in touch, it'll probably go all right for you. It's the podcast, themanrules.com. I'm very, very excited about the podcast. I've had Terry Reel, John Lee, John Caldwell. I do a special men's group where we record ourselves talking about these issues just in a very open and authentic way, just 3 men. So I'm very excited about that. That's my contact information, and a little bit over time, but not too bad.
All right, thank you, Dan.
Namaste. And I will take away the fire.